Good afternoon. Fantastic.
In 2008, President Putin's Russian military conducted an incursion into the former Soviet state of Georgia. And by all accounts, that operation was a failure and their performance abysmal. After withdrawing, President Putin brought his equivalent of an interagency together in Moscow, and he said, "We will fix our army." 6 short years later, Russia annexed Crimea without firing a shot. And then about 8 months later, they conducted an incursion into eastern Ukraine. And by all accounts, the problems that they experienced in the former Soviet Georgia, their ability to conduct intelligence, their ability to conduct logistics, ground combat operations, and integration of air and ground had all been fixed. A year later, in 2015, Russia simultaneously conducts expeditionary operations into Syria. And by all accounts, we're able to sustain both at the same time. Russia to this day, in fact, if you look just 2 months ago, you may have read that there was an incursion, or rather a conflict between the Ukrainian Navy in the Sea of Azov. And days later, National Public Radio asked the question, did they just annex the Sea of Azov? Ladies and gentlemen, my point to you is the world has changed. It's changed in a fundamental way. Our intelligence report would say that of 10 major capabilities that we will need in the next major war for the Army, that of 6 of them, Russia will exceed our capabilities, we'll have parity in 3, and we will dominate in 1 in 10 years. The world has changed. And it's not just one near peer that we worry about, it includes Russia and China. You might see a lot in the media that talks about great power competition, and those powers, unique to the last time we were engaged with a great power competition with Russia, includes 2, both Russia and China. Let me say it to you a little bit, maybe a different way. If you pay attention to the news and what comes out in the news media, you know that we have an army that's been at war for over a decade and it's had costs. If you pay attention to the news, you know there's consternation in Washington. If you pay attention to the news, you know that there is a downward pressure on our budget. And if you pay attention to the news, you know that the Russians are significantly investing in their military. If you ponder that for a minute, you might think I'm talking about 2018. I'm really talking about 1973. And the reason I share that with you is because I think we're in the same spot right now that we were in the late 70s. And the good news is we've been here before, and we know how to do this. But the point is, I said the world's changing, but history will tell us whether we adapted effectively so that the United States, through our military, can continue to have the positive influence throughout the world that we had in the last century. Because in the last century, the Army in particular went through a renaissance of military thinking after Vietnam. And we modernized our Army. And in so doing, including the support and participation and collaboration of the other services, and due in no small part to the investments that the Reagan administration made, we really sent a message to the Soviet Union at the time that brought them to their knees. And what I would tell you is that revolution in military thought changed the world. It changed the world because the wall fell, it became a unipolar world. But here we are again, and the question becomes, to what degree will we be able to have the renaissance in military thinking to lead us through this next century? So ladies and gentlemen, I'm Eric Wesley. I lead the Futures and Concepts Center. We're part of Army Futures Command. It's an honor to be here. Our role is to divine the future operational environment and then blueprint a future Army that can continue the influence that we've had over the last several decades. But it's a joy to be here. I had the chance to spend some time in the reception last night. I think that Bill Stavropoulos and his wife Linda were with us. And of course, Don, he's in the room here somewhere. We were able to have a great conversation. And what I inferred from this, and as I've met some of you, is this is the exact body that we need as a nation as we go forward. That is people that have passion for the United States of America, our role and our responsibility, and what you can do to help us influence that. And I've seen your charter, and that is to inspire and encourage and enable individual leaders in our culture to continue to provide innovative solutions. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk to you about the future of the Army and what changes that we are going to have to make in order to continue to contend with the future problems that face us so that we remain relevant in the future. So thank you for having us here. It's a joy, and it's an honor to be with each and every one of you. I want to just draw a thread through some recent events. You may recognize some of these headlines. The first one has to do with what you see in Russia. And I'll just make a couple of points. I won't cover each of these. I just want to try to draw some trend lines. You heard this idea maybe of great power competition. I'm going to talk more about that later, but let's look at a little bit of what Russia is doing in the world today. The story in the upper right is probably one that nobody is unfamiliar with. In fact, since 2016, we've been consumed with that story associated with the role the Russians have had in our election. There's two narratives out there. One says that maybe the campaign of President Trump had some kind of colluding effort with the Russians. The other narrative might be that Department of Justice, maybe inappropriately or otherwise, pursued the campaign. But what I'm here to suggest to you is I have no interest in that. For the purpose of this discussion, the real question that we might consider is, what is Russia doing? What is it that they are pursuing, and why? The article in the lower right there is about a small power company in Oregon. A small excavating company in Oregon. 15-man company, and they had been hacked by the Russians. Why is that? Well, it turns out that they are one of 24 different companies where Russia pursued the soft underbelly of our cybersecurity and were able to get to hack into power companies throughout the U.S., transcending about 2/3 of the continental U.S. A 15-man company run by a gentleman with no more than a small support to construction. Go to the next chart, if we would. The upper left of this chart shows China in competition, but if you look at the upper left, you probably have seen maybe some stories about Russia building artificial islands in the South China Sea. Why would they be doing that? If you listen to China, they would say that the purpose of those islands is to provide logistics support to seafaring vessels, to include cruise ships and long haulers. We'll talk more about that. What I want to try to do, though, is describe the problem. These things might not be related to you in your mind, but I want to go back to 1991. 1991, there was a decisive fight against Iraq. And when that happened, both China and Russia were put on notice, and they decided they wanted no part of close combat with the United States military, her partners, and her allies. That was reinforced in OIF-1 in 2003. They wanted no part of close combat with the United States military, her partners, and allies. So what they chose to do, and this poses the problem for us, is to invest in multiple layers of standoff. That is the problem. If you're to boil down the problem that we face as an army going into the future, you could boil it down to one single word. So if you're in an elevator sometime and you're with someone and they want to know what problem is the Army trying to solve, and that is multiple layers of standoff, because both of those powers want no part of close combat. And what they've concluded is they can achieve their operational and strategic objectives left of conflict. So they've expanded the competition space, and what you see there, that chart is just intended to show you there's multiple bands of standoff. The first one I talked about with respect to the interference in U.S. elections. See, when they get into the social media space, what they want to do is break our cohesion in the West, both internally, domestically, but also amongst our partners and our allies. So we've seen this behavior not just in the U.S. elections. We saw it in Catalonia, in the break-off threat in Spain, but also in Brexit. An aggressive Russia that seeks to fracture the cohesion of the alliance, that's their first layer of standoff. But they've also built or invested in long-range precision fires, a significant air defense system that precludes us from being able to get back into the continent. Serendipitously, at the same time they were investing in those things, we were withdrawing from the continent and withdrawing from the Korean Peninsula, which traditionally we have done, and we find ourselves in the continental U.S. with a big challenge if we ever had to get back in. So the net effect is Russia and China. It's no surprise that China would be investing in artificial islands in the South China Sea, again, building multiple layers of standoff to preclude us from getting in close. So the question becomes, to what degree could we preclude Russia if they wanted to continue to expand and reestablish the near abroad, which has always been a passion of theirs? What would happen if the Chinese wanted to shut down the sea lanes of the South China Sea? And to what degree could we preclude that while also precluding protracted warfare with two nuclear-capable nations? That's the problem that the United States Army has, and that's what we face today. So how do you fix that problem? If anybody watches boxing and you're a sports fanatic, you know that if you want to defeat Evander Holyfield, you've got to penetrate his reach, and you've got to get on the inside. So we have developed a fairly simple moniker to describe how we're going to fight in the future. We know that the problem is standoff. For the Army, the solution is we first have to compete, expand the competition space, be there where they are, and then if you have to transition to conflict, you've got to quickly penetrate their capabilities, disintegrate their systems, and then exploit those for whatever objectives we might have. I'd like to talk a little bit about the competition space, if we might. This is a difficult challenge, particularly for the United States. We are, if you go back into our DNA as a nation, we really don't see ourselves as a warfighting people. Regardless of what the truth may or may not be, we don't believe we're a warfighting people, and for that reason we have Constitution, we have laws, and we have policies that draw a very clear distinction or threshold that would draw us into conflict. It is almost like it's digital in our minds, and that's why the Constitution is so clear on those things. That's why we constrain the behavior of the uniformed force, because we don't want uniformed military carrying out operations where there isn't a clear distinction on conflict. Sadly, our peers don't see it the same way. And what we find is that both Russia and China blur that clear threshold of conflict and seek to achieve objectives prior to their hitting that threshold. That's why a Russia can annex Crimea without firing a shot. That's why it's unclear who shot down a Malaysian Airlines a few years ago. That's why it's unclear who's actually fighting in eastern Ukraine. Because they've blurred the lines or the distinction or the threshold. So if they are continuing to achieve their objectives in the left of conflict, if they are continuing to achieve their objectives in that space, how do we contend with that? Because clearly the threshold is much further to the right for us. And absent our engagement, absent our ability to engage in that competition space, to counter those things that would be contrary to the goodwill of the United States and what we believe and hold dear, absent that, you will see both China and Russia continue to achieve their objectives. And over the course of the next century, without changing anything, we could imagine that the United States will steadily, incrementally lose influence over the course of the next century. So what we argue is we've got to get into this competition space. And the first is we've got to be able to counter their unconventional warfare and their information warfare. I just mentioned that we've been consumed with 2 years of debate as to what role the Russians played in our 2016 election. And content immaterial, imagine the energy that's consumed from us. What is the relative equivalent to our countering that in that space? You could almost agree with me that it's almost nothing. We've arrested 12 Russians. But to what degree are we countering that behavior in an active way? We believe that in the future, there's got to be a role where we are engaging actively with that kind of behavior. My peer, General Chris Cavoli, who's the United States Army Europe commander, doesn't have the authorities that his counterpart does in Russia. It's a question to consider. The second thing you have to be doing in that competition space is continually stimulating and analyzing what it is our peers are doing. In the 1980s, we used to study the Russian order of battle east of the Fulda Gap every single day. But it was fairly easy because you could use satellites to monitor where they're at, and you could pretty much use geometry to figure out how they're going to fight. Now, when you're talking about cyber, space, electromagnetic warfare, the ability to see where they're at, what they're doing, where their radars are, and how they will build these multiple layers of defense or standoff is very difficult, and it requires active analysis every single day. The problem is we're not there. So we believe that in the future we're going to have to wrestle this problem of presence from which we've withdrawn. We acknowledge that that's not necessarily politically palatable, but the discussion has to happen because absent being there, we find ourselves in a position that we can't do anything about it. I'm going to start wrapping up here because my time is about up. But what I want to share with you is that the world has changed. And I believe that in the future, someone's going to determine the outcome. A nation will determine the outcome. And we know the direction it is going now. But we have to ask these hard questions, and they may be policy questions. They may be means of changing our tactics, et cetera. But the clear thing is we've been here before, and we've seen this. And we changed the world, and the world changed in 1991. Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because you're passionate about the United States and your role as a leader. And so this is a short discussion of what is happening in the world and how the world is changing. The United States Army just established Army Futures Command, and it's our intent to divine what is happening in this theater so that we can make the right investments. And as a parting shot, I would just say to you, if what happened in the Sea of Azov doesn't matter, then you probably wouldn't need to listen to this. If we're not too concerned about Crimea, then you wouldn't need this. If you're not concerned about eastern Ukraine, then this might not be important. If you're not concerned about the potential for Russia to close the Suwalki Gap, reintegrating Kaliningrad into the contiguous space of Russia, and I don't mean to imply that's their intent, but if it was, could we preclude it or could we interfere before we found ourselves in a protracted conflict? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your commitment to what's right. Thank you for your commitment to this program and for enabling us as a nation. God bless each and every one of you. I appreciate you inviting me.
General Wesley, thank you very much.
Thank you.